900,000 years ago, your entire bloodline almost ended. Not figuratively, not poetically. The genetic record says it plainly. The population of every human ancestor alive on Earth, every one of them, fell to roughly 1,280. That is it, 1,200 people, on the whole planet. And it stayed that way for over 100,000 years. That was just one of the resets. There is a pattern buried in the human story that most people never hear about. Not because it is hidden, not because anyone is keeping it from you, but because the scale of it is so large, so repetitive, so unsettling, that it is almost impossible to hold in your mind all at once. Civilizations do not just rise and fall. They rise, flourish, become the most intricate and connected version of themselves, and then they collapse so completely that the next people to walk the same ground have no idea anything was ever there. It has happened over and over, and the evidence is written, quite literally, into your bones. Let me start with the deepest scar, the one that nearly erased us before we even existed as a species. In 2023, a population geneticist named Haipeng Li and his colleagues at the Chinese Academy of Sciences published something in the journal Science that landed like a slow earthquake in the genetics community. They had developed a new method for reading the deep past inside modern DNA, a technique that could trace population patterns backward through the genomes of more than 3,000 living people from populations around the world. What they found was not a dip, not a rough patch. It was a catastrophe. Between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the ancestral population that would eventually become us did not just shrink. It collapsed. 98.7% of our ancestors vanished. The breeding population dropped to around 1,280 individuals. And it stayed there. Not for a generation, not for a century, for 117,000 years. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 117,000 years of near extinction. To put that in perspective, the entirety of recorded human history, every pharaoh, every dynasty, every war, every cathedral, every civilization that has ever risen or fallen since we started writing things down, that is about 5,000 years. The bottleneck lasted more than 20 times longer than all of recorded history combined. 20 times over. Generation after generation born into a world where the total number of people who could have children was smaller than the population of a village. Smaller than most high schools. Every birth mattered. Every season of food mattered. Every illness that swept through a band of 50 people was not just a tragedy. It was a threat to the future of the species. Nobody knows exactly what caused it. The timing overlaps with a brutal stretch of ice age during what geologists call the mid-Pleistocene transition, a period when Africa became colder and drier than almost any time in human history. The fossil record in Africa and Eurasia goes nearly silent during this window. Bones that should be there are missing. Sites that should show habitation show nothing. It is as if someone turned the lights off for 100,000 years and then, slowly, turned them back on. And here is the part that stays with me, long after the numbers fade. The researchers estimated that 2/3 of all human genetic diversity was lost during that window. Gone. Entire branches of the family tree, entire ways of being human, snapped off and scattered. The genetic richness that had been building for millions of years was reduced to a whisper. And when the population finally recovered, somewhere around 800,000 years ago, the humans who emerged on the other side were different. Some scientists believe that Bottleneck may have driven the very changes, including the expansion of brain size, that eventually made us who we are. We were nearly erased. And from that erasure, something new was born. Now, you might think a near-extinction event of that magnitude would be a one-time catastrophe. The kind of thing that happens once in the life of a species and then never again. But the deeper you look into the record, the more you find that the thread has been cut, or nearly cut, again and again. Roughly 75,000 years ago, in what is now Sumatra, Indonesia, a supervolcano called Toba erupted with a force that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. It was one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years. The eruption ejected so much material into the atmosphere that ash layers from it have been found in lake sediments in East Africa, nearly 7,000 kilometers away. Ash blanketed South Asia in layers meters deep. Global temperatures plunged. The skies darkened across hemispheres. The original hypothesis, first proposed in the late 1990s, suggested that the human population collapsed to fewer than 10,000 individuals in the aftermath. A volcanic winter lasting years. Forests stripped bare. Food chains shattered from the bottom up. That number has been challenged in recent years, and honestly, the challenge makes the story even more remarkable. Archaeologists working in India, Indonesia, and China have found stone tools layered directly above the Toba ash. Tools that continued right through the eruption. People did not just survive, they adapted. In at least one site in southern Africa, they appear to have adopted bow and arrow technology around this time, as if the catastrophe itself forced a kind of invention born from desperation. But the genetic signature is still there, faint but visible. Something happened to us around that time. The diversity narrowed. The line thinned. Again and again, the survivors became the ancestors of everyone who followed. And then came the strangest bottleneck of all. The one that was not caused by a volcano or a climate shift or an ice age, but by something far harder to explain. Something that came from inside. Around 7,000 years ago, something happened to men, not to women, not to the overall population, just to men. Across Africa, Europe, and Asia, simultaneously, male genetic diversity crashed. When researchers first analyzed Y chromosome data from more than 300 modern populations worldwide, the picture was stark. For every 17 women who successfully passed on their genes during this period, only one man did. 1 in 17. Let that settle. Female population sizes kept climbing. The number of women having children continued to grow steadily across the planet. But male lineages were being erased at a staggering rate. Entire paternal lines, just gone. And this was not a local event. It happened on 3 continents at roughly the same time, and it lasted for nearly 2,000 years. When this pattern was first discovered in 2015, the leading explanation was violence. Patrilineal clans, groups of closely related men, warring against each other so thoroughly that when one group lost, its entire male genetic line was extinguished. More recent research from 2018 and 2024 has proposed an alternative. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming may have restructured societies around a small number of dominant family lines, concentrating reproductive success into fewer and fewer men, not through slaughter, but through inheritance and social hierarchy. Either way, the result written in the DNA is the same. 7,000 years ago, the human story was rewritten from the inside. Not by a volcano, not by a drought, not by an ice age, by something we did to ourselves, by the way we chose to organize our lives. But that was only the beginning of the collapses we can see with our own eyes. If you are still here, I think you should be. Because the pattern does not stop at the genetic level. It plays out across the surface of the Earth in a way that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. Take me to the year 2200 BCE. The city of Akkad is the capital of the first true empire in human history. The Akkadian Empire stretches across Mesopotamia. It has courts and scribes and diplomacy. Trade flows between cities that have existed for 1,000 years. It is, by every measure, a civilization at its peak. Then, the rains stop. Across the entire northern hemisphere, from Egypt to China to the Indus Valley, the climate breaks. Geologists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event, and it was so severe that it defines the boundary of our current geological age, the Megaloyan. Not a bad decade. A structural shift in the atmosphere that lasted centuries. The Akkadian Empire collapses. Refugees flood south. A wall is built across central Mesopotamia to hold back nomadic peoples driven from the drying plains. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom crumbles after the Nile fails year after year. Thousands of kilometers away, the great planned cities of the Indus Valley begin to empty, their populations scattering southeast in search of water. In China, the Liangzhu culture vanishes. 4 civilizations, 4 corners of the ancient world, all within roughly a century, all broken by the same shift in the sky. There is something about that simultaneity that I find both terrifying and clarifying. We tend to think of collapse as something that happens to one society at a time, a local failure, a specific weakness exploited. But the 4.2 kiloyear event shows something different. It shows that the climate does not negotiate. It does not distinguish between the empire with good institutions and the one with bad ones. When the rain stops across an entire hemisphere, everyone falls. And then the understanding begins to disappear. The Indus Valley had a writing system. Symbols carved into seals, pressed into clay, etched into pottery. We have found thousands of examples scattered across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. And we cannot read a single one of them. Not a word, not a name, not a number. Somewhere, at some point, there was a final person who could look at those symbols and know what they said. And when that person died, a door closed that has never reopened. We do not even know what questions to ask about what was lost. That is the cruelest kind of forgetting, the kind where you do not know what you have forgotten. This is what a reset actually looks like, not the buildings falling. That is the part everyone remembers. The part that matters is the understanding leaving, the knowledge walking out the door and never coming back. 1,000 years after the Akkadian collapse, it happens again. Bigger this time. By 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean is a web of interconnected civilizations more sophisticated than anything the world has seen. The Hittites rule Anatolia. The Mycenaeans dominate Greece. Egypt is a superpower. The port city of Ugarit is a crossroads of international trade. They exchange diplomatic letters. They share technologies. They depend on each other for critical materials, especially tin and copper, the ingredients for bronze. And then, within 50 years, nearly all of it is gone. Cities burn, libraries are destroyed. Bodies lie unburied in the streets of cities that had stood for centuries. The Hittite Empire disappears entirely, so thoroughly that its existence was forgotten until archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century. Mycenaean civilization collapses. Ugarit is destroyed and never rebuilt. The writing system known as Linear B vanishes from use in Greece. An older script, Linear A from Minoan Crete, was already lost. Now its successor follows it into silence. The Mediterranean enters a dark age that lasts roughly 300 years. Nobody can fully explain what happened. Drought, earthquakes, invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, internal revolts, the fracture of trade networks, all of these played a role. But the most striking explanation comes from complexity theory. These civilizations had become so interconnected, so dependent on each other for critical materials, so specialized in their functions, that when one node failed, the collapse cascaded through the entire system like a shock wave. They were not destroyed in spite of their sophistication. They were destroyed because of it. Their greatest achievement, the network itself, became the mechanism of their destruction. One detail from the Bronze Age collapse that I cannot stop thinking about is the letters. In the ruins of Ugarit, archaeologists found a clay tablet, still in the kiln where it was being fired when the city was destroyed. It was a letter, addressed to the king of a neighboring state, begging for help. Ships had been spotted on the horizon. The army was gone. The city was defenseless. The letter was never sent. It was still in the kiln when the flames came. Someone was trying to call for help, and the world ended before the clay was dry. 300 years pass, and from the ashes, everything starts over. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Israelites, new peoples carrying new alphabets and new gods, rising from rubble they barely understood, building a world that would have no memory of the one that came before. The Greeks who later wrote the Iliad had no idea that the Mycenaean civilization they dimly remembered through myth had been literate, bureaucratic, palace-building people with written records and international treaties. That knowledge was gone. Only the stories survived, and even those were transformed beyond recognition. I keep thinking about the Roman concrete. When Rome fell in the 5th century, the losses were staggering and specific in ways that still shock me. Literacy across Western Europe dropped from roughly 20% in the urban Roman world to less than 1% by 600 CE. That is not a gradual decline. That is a cliff. Within the span of a few generations, the ability to read, the ability to access the accumulated knowledge of centuries, simply evaporated from most of the continent. Entire libraries were scattered or destroyed. Trade networks that had moved goods from Britain to Egypt simply stopped. But the detail that haunts me most is the concrete. The Romans had developed a formula, volcanic ash mixed with lime and seawater, that created a material so durable it strengthened over time. When cracks formed, the chemistry sealed them. It was, in a sense, self-healing stone. The Pantheon in Rome was built with this material nearly 1900 years ago. Its dome stretches 43 meters across. No rebar, no steel reinforcement, just concrete, shaped by engineers who understood something about chemistry and compression that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. It is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth. Nobody has beaten it in almost 2 millennia. Most modern concrete begins degrading within 50 to 100 years. The Pantheon barely notices the centuries passing. And when the empire fell, the recipe vanished. For 1,300 years, nobody on the planet knew how to make it. The building stood there the entire time, in the center of Rome, visited by millions across the centuries, testifying silently to what had been lost. And still, no one could reverse engineer the knowledge that built it. It was not until the 19th century that scientific analysis even began to uncover the secrets of Roman concrete. And we are still learning. That is the hidden cost of a reset. Not just the death, not just the destruction, the forgetting, the quiet, total disappearance of understanding so complete that people can stand inside the evidence of what was lost and still not recover it. The Maya knew this cost too, though they experienced it from the other side. Before the collapse of their classic period cities in the 9th century, they had built one of the most sophisticated astronomical traditions in human history. They calculated the length of the solar year to 365.2420 days. The modern measurement, made with atomic clocks and satellites, is 365.2422. They were off by less than half a minute per year, using nothing but naked eye observation and mathematics carved into stone. When the Spanish arrived centuries later, they burned the codices, thousands of documents, centuries of astronomical calculation, mathematical reasoning, calendrical systems, medical knowledge, historical memory, all of it fed to the flames by men who believed they were destroying the work of the devil. What survived fits in a handful of fragments, 4 codices out of thousands. An entire civilization's intellectual legacy, reduced to scraps that we spend lifetimes trying to understand. Every collapse strips something irreplaceable from the human record, and every recovery begins in ignorance of what came before. That is the cycle. Not just that empires fall, Everyone knows empires fall. The cycle is that when they fall, they take understanding with them. And the people who rebuild never know what they are missing. A NASA-funded study put it plainly. The process of rise and collapse is a recurrent cycle found throughout history. Not an anomaly, not a surprise. A pattern visible across more than 30 documented civilizations, driven by the same mechanisms every time. Complexity increases. Resources concentrate. The system becomes too intricate to sustain. And then it breaks. And here is the question that sits at the center of all of this, the one I cannot shake. We are, right now, the most interconnected civilization in the history of the species. Our supply chains span the globe. Our technologies depend on rare materials sourced from a handful of locations. Our energy systems, our food systems, our financial systems are linked in ways that no single person fully understands. We rely on a metal called lithium, the way the Bronze Age relied on tin. We have, by every measure, built the most complex society that has ever existed. The pattern does not say this is dangerous. The pattern says this is exactly what happens every time, right before the reset. Complexity peaks, dependencies deepen, and then the thing that made us powerful becomes the thing that makes us fragile. I am not saying it is coming. I do not know that. Nobody does. But I know that every civilization that fell believed, at its peak, that it was the exception. The Akkadians had the first empire. The Mycenaeans had international diplomacy. The Romans had self-healing concrete and heated floors and running water, and every one of them vanished so completely that later, people had to rediscover their existence. If these patterns move you the way they move me, and you want to keep exploring them, consider subscribing. This is the kind of story I keep coming back to. Because here is what the record actually tells us, underneath all the fear and all the loss. I keep coming back to the 1280. That number. 1280 people, carrying the entire future of humanity in their bodies for 100,000 years. Every person alive today. Every city. Every language. Every hospital and symphony and argument and act of ordinary courage. All of it. Every thread of it. Descending from that small, desperate band of survivors who held on through a darkness so deep we cannot even imagine its shape. They did not know what they were preserving. They could not have known. They were just living, just enduring, just waking up each morning in a world that was trying, in every possible way, to end them. And choosing, without any guarantee, without any story that told them it would be worth it, to continue. The cycle is real. The collapses are real. The losses, every lost language, every vanished formula, every undeciphered script, those are permanent, and they are heartbreaking. But so is the recovery. So is the stubborn, unreasonable, almost miraculous persistence of the human line through supervolcanoes and ice ages and megadroughts, and the fall of every empire that ever believed it was eternal. That is what the record shows, beneath the terror. Not just fragility. Endurance. 900,000 years ago, 1,200 people stood between everything we are and nothing at all. They did not build monuments. They did not write their names. They did not know they were saving the world. They just did not stop.